Education is the passport to the future. For tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today.
The month of March is one of the most awaited months on the part of the students, as well as, of course, for those parents who for their first time ever see their son or daughter be one of those members of the completer who march during the processional. I am pretty sure that it's been already a month-long waiting and preparation. However, March 15, 2020 marks the most unforgettable day on the life of the students. This is the time the whole nation was in a total lockdown. It has stopped almost everything. Rapidly, school closure was implemented, and so giving recognition to all the students who have proved their worth to become a member of this year's completer will be done through a moving up virtual ceremony.
Thus, today signifies the culmination of the 4 long years of struggle in the relentless pursuit of knowledge. Knowledge that will enable a learner to become a better individual, to embrace opportunities and take the challenges with clear vision and purpose. Because today, we do not only celebrate the end of the formal academic training in junior high school, but we are here also to celebrate the beginning of your quest for higher learning. My name is Gina M. Lacunsay, and I am honored to be your Master of Ceremony for today.
And my name is Caroline A. Cayabyab, and I am equally pleased to be your Master of Ceremony today.
With that, welcome to Speaker Eugenio Perez National Agricultural School, Junior High School, 5th Virtual Moving Up Ceremony.
To start with, I just want to greet the people who grace this virtual ceremony. To our distinguished and highly esteemed members of academic community, led by dynamic and supportive officer in charge, Office of the School's Division Superintendent, Dr. Lourdes D. Servito, the epitome of empowered women and a great school leader, our very own principal, Dr. Marites Velasco Cabatbat, the indefatigable assistant school principal too, Dr. Lyndon F. Garcia, equally brilliant head teachers from the different departments, officers and members of the General Parent Teachers Association, colleagues, members of the 2020 completers, parents, friends, ladies and gentlemen, a blessed day to everyone.
May I invite everyone to join me as we express our salutation and nationalism to the Philippine flag by singing our national anthem, to be followed immediately by the singing of Pangasinan hymn and loyalty song through an audio-visual presentation.
Lupa kanya binabli Deun mo taniya ligwas Diuragep ko lawas Dan puso Pangasinan Agkanalingwanan Luyak ko yaniyanakan Bedegdakan yaman Mantuan nalikwas mula tayaneng nela Kasih baluri di mapula Say pangkakasakti na kay nalilik na Labut ka na mabresika Say dayag mundak na'y datuktan sa yaman Sedeng nakapalan ngayon Karunan tan samping mo Pangasinan Pagyan tan lawas Bantayan Lawas takan ikang duro Pangasinan Arwen kakal kayo buwan Panang apupong wala na bangunan Ikikinon ko syubaman Pangasinan luyang minadyawan
Let's give a round for dear Sepnas. Let us all sing to her anew. Others may think it's black or crimson, but to us it's green and gold. Let all troubles be forgotten, and let's go spirit low. For we are all singing for dear Sepnas, for the good of our own school. Oh, San Carlos, oh, dear Sepnas, the pride of all Pangasinan. Come on, we all grads, join us, the young lads, for it is now time to cheer up, run, now it's the time, boys, to make a big noise, no matter what the people say. For we are all glad here, the gang's all here, so hail our dear Sepnas, oh San Carlos, oh dear Sepnas, the pride of all Pangasinan. Come on, we all grads, join us, the young lads, for it is now time to cheer up, run, now it's the time, boys, to make a big noise, no matter what the people say. For we are all glad here, the gang's all here, so hail our dear Sepnas, oh.
Let us all invoke the presence of the Divine Father in heaven through a prayer to be led by Hani Lin A. Puyawan, the completer, with the third highest general average.
Let us bow our heads and feel the presence of our divine Creator. In the name of the Father, of the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we praise you for the daily victories you are giving us. We thank you for the blessings of learning, for the gift of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. We are grateful for the constant love and support of our families. Today is a gift from you. As we gathered with hearts filled with joy and excitement, as we start this joyful event that will be cherished in our hearts and soul through your guidance, we offer our thanks and praises for the success in our journey. Bless us, O Lord, with hope, so that we can move into the future with eager and open hearts. Inspire us more to believe in the goodness of life, even we are faced with challenges and difficulties. May we grow ever more grateful, humble, and wise. Lord, we seek for your will. We know that everything is in your sovereign control. We ask you to protect us from sickness and viruses and keep us safe all the time. You are our shield. Cover us with your love and protection. Shower upon us the good health, blessings, and happiness. Remove any fear, doubt, and stress. We believe that you are more than able to keep us safe during these times. Father, forgive us for all the wrong things we have done. Fill our hearts with righteous thoughts and clean desires. Help us live our lives, praising and bringing you glory. We trust you and follow your will. All praise, honor, and glory be yours. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit. Amen.
At this juncture, the debonair Assistant School Principal to Dr. Lyndon F. Garcia will give us his words of welcome.
You have pledged your best efforts, skills, and determination. With this, you will now grab your greatest pleasures and rewards. The big climax in your junior high school life is about to unfold. Here in Sepnas' Facebook page, the new normal gathering will put on air in the Sepnasians' high level of consciousness. Because of this COVID-19 and social distancing, junior high school completion ceremony is a lot different than anything we've seen before. One of the best things we can do for this year's completion is to find ways to honor your achievements. To our honored guests, to our new and competent Assistant Schools Division Superintendent, Dr. Lourdes D. Servito, our brilliant Assistant Schools Division Superintendent, Mr. Mario S. Carino, our ever-supportive Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Ellen C. Guzman, our devoted Principal, Dr. Marites B. Kabatbat, our Administrative Officer 4, Mr. J.B. Gonzalez, Department Heads, Teachers, Administrative and Facilitative Staff, Parents, Friends, Ladies and Gentlemen, a delightful and pleasurable day. Junior high school completion is an exciting time. It makes both an ending and a beginning. It is a warm memories of the past and a big dreams of the future. It may have been long overdue, but I anticipate that this online virtual completion program will rekindle the delayed excitement and pleasure in celebrating your success. And I know as you proceed to the next chapter of your academic life, certainly bright prospects abound, but challenges and uncertainties will be there as well. I earnestly pray that this virtual event be your launching pad for you to be more inspired, lifelong learners, and be more confident to follow your instinct and interests wherever they lead, and broaden your knowledge by being open to new learning as much as you can. Embrace opportunities to collaborate, since it's the key to our success as a society and help us grow as individuals. The entire Sepnas teachers and staff Believe in your potential to make a positive difference in this world. And so, we want you to believe the same. Learn to appreciate what you have accomplished. Express thanks to those who have helped you. And take a little time every day to be grateful for the opportunity you have. To the proud parents and guardians who have worked so hard and gave their best to their children, no matter how difficult life is, my genuine congratulations. And to the teachers who have persistently done their incredible task, especially the faculty who are behind this virtual completion ceremony, a job well done. In behalf of Sepnas teachers, facilitated and administrative staff, I welcome you all to this historic and one-of-a-kind milestone of virtual gathering. A blessed day, everyone.
Thank you, sir, for that heartwarming and words of welcome. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the candidates for completion school year 2019-2020 to be presented by Dr. Marites V. Cabatbat, School Principal 4, after the audio-visual presentation.
Today is a milestone, and it tells us how far we have come. A sweet ending and a head start for a new journey in our life. This day marks a newer beginning for these 848 grade 10 completers for the school year 2019-2020. We would like to show our deepest gratitude and appreciation to our teachers and parents who have guided us in this journey. May I present to you the candidates for completion. Grade 10 Diamond, devotees of excellence and integrity. The brilliance and strength they manifest proves how unconquerable diamonds can be. Grade 10 Gold, explorers of ingenuity and innovation. The sparkle of gold surely illuminates their path to success. Grade 10 Ruby, patrons of resiliency and flexibility. Builders of resiliency today, fighters of change for tomorrow. Grade 10 Copper, innovators of exceptional artistry. They are the artists in their field and painters of their future. Grade 10 Quartz, advocates of positivity and tranquility. The strong spirits they possess make them the best in their field. Grade 10 Meteorite, agents of commitment and responsibility. Passionate minds bring them to the peak of their success. Grade 10 Uranium, warriors of enthusiasm and compassion. Courage is what fuels their desire for triumph in life. Grade 10 Jade, epitome of beauty and passion. Harmony is what makes their team the dream. Grade 10 Opal, catalysts of hard work and service. The willpower to succeed can surely lead them to success. Grade 10 Granite, defenders of elegance and sophistication. Fierce souls are conveyed by the eyes of these warriors. Grade 10 Topaz, models of virtues and perfection. Optimism is truly radiated by these visionaries. Grade 10 Nickel, exemplars of loyalty and confidence. The ceaseless will to pursue their dreams is incredible. Grade 10 Amethyst, influencers of serenity and spiritual tranquility. Their divine souls make them the purest of hearts. Grade 10 Ivory, embodiments of respect and discipline. Their resolute determination embodies the truest wisdom. Grade 10 Xenon, beholders of creativity and innovation. Fighters indeed on the path of righteousness. Grade 10 Krypton,
luminous elements of charm and inspiration. Nothing is impossible for these believers. Grade 10 Silver, preservers of sympathy and camaraderie. The luminous glow they hold can enlighten the path to victory. Grade 10 Sapphire, initiators of transformation and progress. With integrity, these students have nothing to fear. Grade 10 Bronze, paragons of determination and perseverance. Great works are performed by these persevering students. Grade 10 Emerald, front-runners of good leadership and alliance. These genuine leaders are molders of consensus and great harmony. Grade 10 Garnet, difference makers and problem solvers. These visionaries always seek opportunities for success. Grade 10 Pearl, confidence of vision and purpose. These strong hearts fuel the will to achieve triumph in life. With the end of this chapter of our lives, we will soon know that it's time to start something new and trust the magic of new beginnings. Congratulations to our Grade 10 completers.
To our Public Schools District Supervisor of District 5A, Madam Ellen C. de Guzman, may I have the honor to present to you the 848 candidates for junior high school completion for the school year 2019-2020. 385 of them are males and 463 are females. I certify that they have successfully completed all the requirements for the K-12 basic education program as prescribed by the Department of Education in junior high school. I therefore recommend for their confirmation as completers, and they be bestowed with all the rights and privileges thereto appertaining.
Members of the Completers 2020, you will now be confirmed by the Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Ellen C. de Guzman.
By virtue of the authority delegated upon me by the school's division superintendent, and with the strong recommendation of your very dynamic school principal, Dr. Marites Kabatbat, I do hereby accept, confirm, and proclaim you junior high school completers of Speaker Eugenio Perez National Agricultural School for the school year 2019-2020 with all the rights and privileges thereunto appertaining. Congratulations.
Put in life perspective with some short yet sage pieces of advice. These wise and beautiful words from your favorite positive thinkers will get you in the right mindset to tackle whatever obstacles lie ahead. As Angelina Jolie said, life comes with many challenges. The ones that should not scare us are the ones we can take on and take control of. So completers, listen with all your heart as our confirming official, Dr. Ellen C. de Guzman, gave her short message.
I am indeed so happy to convey my congratulatory message to all of you, even it's just virtually. Our department, the Department of Education, will definitely not miss the opportunity to recognize your achievements after hurdling 4 academic years for your junior high school education. Hence, we are having this virtual completion ceremony. Your completion ceremony may be unique, as it may seem, due to the pandemic crisis which crippled not only our country but also the whole world. Nonetheless, your beloved alma mater is making it extra special because just like your seniors, you deserve the best form of accolades. You being confirmed as completers signals that you successfully acquired the required competencies set forth by DepEd for junior high school students. Moreover, it means that you have conquered the toughest challenges and have met your self-imposed expectations as well as those of others. Thus, you rightfully deserve your certificates. Earning a certificate bequeaths you with honor and privilege. May you enjoy them fully, but with utmost sense of responsibility, most especially that the present time calls for heroes and heroines who are willing to unleash their potential and unselfishly give service to others. In your own way, may I encourage you to join the League. Be with us in making even just one simple move forward, because such will surely bring significant progress to our country and to the world. Again, congratulations and keep on soaring high, Completers 2020.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for that inspiring message. Truly, nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. Marie Curie said, to inspire us more and to learn more, may I invite everyone to listen attentively to our guest speaker as he delivers his message. And to present our guest speaker, our very own principal, Dr. Marites V. Kabatbat, will do the honor.
The essence of this moving up ceremony would not be laid down without having someone who will in a minute deliver a message that would inspire, motivate, and strengthen the morale of our dear completers. With this person's words that speak a volume of inspiration and challenge, I hope that you will see the moral compass in him that would guide you rightfully as you take another step in your educational upbringing. Hence, it is with deepest pride and honor to introduce to you the man of the hour for this virtual moving up ceremony. Today's speaker is an outstanding product of Sepnas. In fact, it is through the technical vocational-centric curriculum of Sepnas that led him to excel in his niche in agriculture. Born on April 24, 1974, this man has started out his journey towards excellence at Pagal Elementary School, San Carlos City, and graduated as valedictorian. Then here in our own institution, as second honorable mention, class of 1991. And because Sepnas has equipped him with high standards of discipline and wisdom, it is not therefore surprising that he finished with flying colors his Bachelor Science degree in Agriculture, major in Animal Science at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. His Scholar ng Bayan stint did not stop as he pursued his Masters of Science in Biochemistry and Doctor of Philosophy in Biochemistry, respectively, both in the same campus. He also carried out his postdoctoral training at the University of Illinois in Chicago from 2015 to 2016. Indeed, this accomplished man lives by the mantra, Tatak Sepnas. His excellence in all dimensions can also be attested by the numerous awards that he garnered in his chosen field, the most prominent of which is being proclaimed as the PSAS most outstanding teacher in animal science. Aside from his technical skills in animal nutrition, beef production, animal biotechnology, and agricultural chemistry, this man is also an author and contributor of a number of prestigious publications, researches, and other scientific papers in making him a certified science supernova. At present, our guest is an Associate Professor 7 in Ruminant Nutrition and Production at the Institute of Animal Science, College of Agriculture, Food and Science at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. He is also the current director for Dairy Training and Research Institute at the same constituent university. Sans his meaningful work experience, employment records, educational attainment, and recognitions that this man received, he still remains humble, making him the epitome of a virtuous Sepnasian. I know that you are more than excited to meet him. And so with this, everybody join me in welcoming our guest of honor and speaker in the persona of Dr. Amado Aguilar Angeles.
Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat, mga magsisipagtapos ng grade 10 ng Sepnas ngayong 2020. Bago po ang lahat, gusto ko pong pasalamatan ng ating kasalukuyang principal, si Dr. Kabatbat. Good afternoon po. Sa kanya pong assistant principal, si Dr. Garcia. Good afternoon po. At sa lahat 10 ng aking mga naging teacher sa Sepnas sa pangunguna na po ni Ma'am Magleo. Good afternoon, ma'am. Kumusta na po kayo? At sana po ay kayo ay manatiling malusog, masaya. Ang inyo pong lingkod ay nung isang araw na naka-text or nakausap ko po si Ma'am Magleo para po makapagbigay ng konting pananalita, no, sa mga magsisipagtapos ngayong araw na to, no, na mga estudyante ng grade 10. Isa pong karangalan na makapagbigay ng guide, no, para po sa mga magsisipagtapos ngayon, no. Ang inyo pong natapos ay sa panahon namin ay kapareho din lang ng pag-graduate namin sa high school, no. Ako po ay isa ring dating gusgusin na pakalat-kalat dyan sa campus ng Sepnas. At may konting pagbabago sa Sepnas, but basically gumanda, no, ang Sepnas. But of course, yung configuration ng campus ay more or less ganun pa rin, no. At gusto ko pong ikwento muna, no, bago yung aking speech, na ang program po namin ng nakaraan ay more of agriculture, no. Membro po ako ng Future Farmers of the Philippines, no, na aming programa nung ako po ay nag-aaral ng high school sa Sepnas. Ang pagtatapos po ninyo ay pangunahin ng hangarin, no. Unang-una, hindi po ng ating mga teacher, kung hindi po unang-una ng inyong mga magulang. So gusto ko munang i-congratulate ang mga parents, no, ang nanay, ang tatay, ang kung sino man po ang pangunahing nagsumuporta sa inyong pag-aaral. Ang kasiyahan po ng mga bata o ng ating mga completers ay more or less konti lamang kung ikukumpara natin sa kasiyahan ng ating mga magulang. Siyempre, yung pong mga teacher na naging pangalawang magulang ng ating mga completers sa panahong nasa loob sila ng ating classroom, nasa loob ng campus. Ang patuloy niyong pagsisilbi, no, sa ating bansa, sa ating bayan, para nang sa gayon ay maihulma, maiprepare yung ating mga susunod na henerasyon na eventually magiging sandigan ng ating bayan sa susunod na panahon, ang mga teacher po ng Sepnas. Bilang isa ding teacher sa ngayon, no, hindi ko po pinangarap din na maging teacher, but napag-isip-isipan ko na ang pagiging guro po, no, ay isa na sa pinakamarangal na trabaho, no, na pwede nating maging profesyon sa ating buhay. At ang pagtuturo sa isang state university, kapareho din ng pagtuturo sa Sepnas, ay isang opportunity, no, na not everybody is given the chance to teach and to serve. Ang mga magsisipagtapos, siguro po ang isa lang na masasabi ko po sa inyo ay atin pong hulmahin, ating planuhin ang ating kinabukasan. Despite the state of health emergency that we have now in the world, mas challenging po yung ating senaryo, no? Yung platform na gagamitin natin sa ating grades 11 at 12 will be more challenging considering the lack, no, of resources that we have, no? Yung ating mga programa, no, sa pagtuturo sa mga susunod na araw ay definitely magiging kakaiba, no, kumpara doon sa sit-in classes that we have. Sa ngayon, no, ang malaki po siguro nating kailangang gawin, no, ay prepara yung sarili natin para mas maging creative, no, hindi lang po sa mga teacher, mas maging matyaga, no, dahil po tayo ay nasa isang panahon kung saan tayo, no, bilang mga estudyante at mga teacher ay hinahanap yung pinakamagandang paraan kung paano po magtuloy-tuloy, no, na matrain yung ating mga susunod na henerasyon ng estudyante. So, ang palagi ko pong tinatanong sa mga estudyante ko, no, bago nagsisimula yung klase, sa form of a challenge to them, no, tinatanong ko na, ang mga estudyante po ba ay kailangan na mas maging magaling kesa sa kanilang naging mga teacher, no, pagdating ng panahon. So the question is actually, will the student, no, you student will be better than your teachers after a while, no, or after completing your own program or your own profession. It's a challenging question that most student would of course answer, syempre hindi kasi kami ay estudyante at definitely mas magaling yung teacher namin kesa sa amin, no? So, but it's really a challenge question that we throw to our students, encouraging them, no, to work on their weaknesses, no, to be stronger in their endeavors. At syempre, hindi naman ikasasama ng loob ng ating mga teacher kung sabihin talaga natin na dapat mas maging magaling yung estudyante kaysa sa mga teachers natin. Kasi kung pagdating ng panahon yung estudyante ay mas mahina kaysa dun sa teacher, paatras po yung generation natin. And it's a challenge that I live, no, until now. Nung po ako ay nandyan sa Sepnas, palagi ko pong sinasabi sa sarili ko na I'll keep a simple attitude, no, maging simple, hindi masyadong nagsasalita, no? But later on I realized that I want a lot of things, no, as far as me being active in the campus. Marami po akong gustong gawin na later on nasabi ko kung ginawa ko lang, no? At may konting pagsisisi. When I was able to enter UP, no, isa po ito sa mga turning points na nagbigay sa akin ng idea na ang ating kakaharapin sa buhay ay punong-puno ng challenges, no? Diyan po sa ating high school, hindi po tayo exposed, no, sa mga socialization. So pagdating po nyo sa isang campus kung saan ang mga kaklase nyo po ay lahat valedictorian ng kanilang mga high school ay talaga pong manliliit tayo. Manliliit to a point that akala natin hindi natin kayang mag-compete. But the realities are, if we keep doing what we need to do, no, we keep ourselves being open to the challenges in life, makikita po natin na kaya po rin pala nating mag-compete. Ngayon po ako ay isang profesor na dito sa UP Los Baños, no? Isa po sa, actually ang UP Los Baños po ang pinaka forefront ng agricultural education in the country. And after completing my Bachelor of Science in Agriculture with specialization in animal science, I took an extra step, no, to not just to go into MS program also in the same field, but I took biochemistry as my MS and PhD. So yung challenges po natin na na-experience diyan sa high school, no, yung hirap po ng buhay, yung mga sakripisyo po ng ating mga magulang ay isa pong mahalagang pundasyon that will change our state of mind to be better person, to be able to surpass challenges in life, no. Gumraduate po ako sa isang public high school, but I was able to finish a PhD in biochemistry, and that's a challenging endeavor, no, that I was able to accomplish. So I would like to challenge everyone, lahat po ng completers ng grade 10, na hindi po huli ang lahat, no, para planuhin nyo, no, yung inyong mga susunod na hakbang. Ang grade 11 at 12 ay challenging because these are the programs in grades 11 and 12 is more of a tooling program that will enable you to be skilled person in the next 2 or 3 years of your life. And you are quite lucky, no, because yung 2 taon na napadagdag sa program nyo ay taya, no, ng gobyerno, nang sa gayon ang mga susunod na graduates natin sa high school ay makapag-compete hindi lang sa universities dito sa ating bansa, sa magagandang university, kung hindi maging aligned din yung ating mga estudyante to be able to enter international arena, no, in terms of higher education. So muli po, ako po ay nagagalak na may mga susunod na namang mga estudyante na nanggaling sa Sepnas para po ituloy yung legacy ng Sepnasian, no? Tingnan po natin na ang although challenging, no, ang panahon kung kailan kayo magko-complete ng inyong grade 10, ito po din ay memorable, no? And despite the challenges of the present, our teachers, our administrators in our school is doing their best to plan ahead, no, to do the necessary adjustments in our curricula, no, to be relevant in this case of national health emergency. And we hope that makatapos agad kayo sa madaling panahon ng inyong grades 11 and grade 11 and 12. So muli po, ako po si Dong Angeles, umaasa pong kayo ay sa mga susunod na araw ay ma-meet ko kasi palagi naman po kami dyan sa Sepnas para magbigay ng konting tulong sa mga pumapasok nating mga estudyante. Muli po, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat at mabuhay kayo, mabuhay ang inyong mga magulang, mabuhay ang mga teachers natin dyan sa Sepnas. Thank you po.
Thank you very much, sir, for the very encouraging and insightful message you imparted this afternoon. Your words will surely guide our completers as they tread a new path in their lives. May your messages motivate them to strive harder. We now come to the most awaited part of this virtual ceremony, the distribution of certificates and awarding of medals to the cream of the crop of each class. Completers, keep your eyes open as you watch your photos be zoomed on the screen.
Ladies and gentlemen, this year's Grade 10 Diamond Completer, Advisor, Dr. Caroline A. Cayabyab, Cuderes Ruel L. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo U. Cuderes. Kutanda Jomar Eric F. with honors, Math Wizard, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rofo Kutanda. De Guzman Everson A. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel F. De Guzman. De Guzman Nathan Dave T. with honors, Eugenio's Sports Writer of the Year, Filipino, son of Mr. and Mrs. Oliver P. De Guzman. De Los Santos Samuel E. with honors, Best in Interpretatibong Pagbasa, Outstanding SSG Officer of the Year, SSG Got Talent First Runner-Up, National Leadership Training, son of Mrs. Alma E. De Los Santos. Gonzales John Irvin D. with high honors, son of Mrs. Ana Victoria Gonzales. Gutierrez Ron D. with high honors, Math Wizard, son of Mr. and Mrs. Restituto Gutierrez. Jarilio Vincent M. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Jarilio. Malikdam Aaron Kurt V. with honors, Science Wizard. Sports Awardee, Table Tennis, son of Mr. and Mrs. Patricia P. Malikdam Jr. Peralta Dex C. with honors, SDRRM Leader of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Lyndon A. Peralta. Reyes John Lawrence U. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Luis C. Reyes. Solis Limuel R. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Randy Z. Soles. Villamor Javi C. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jobito U. Villamor. Villegas Mark Angelo Z. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Efren G. Villegas. Abay Carmina A. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Maximo R. Abay. Aquino Madjovian D. with honors, Eugenio Saitek Feature Writer of the Year, Filipino, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose P. Aquino. Bautiste Adriana E. with honors, Sports Awardee, Dance Sports, Semper Fidelis Award, Eugenio's Online Editorial Writer of the Year, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rene F. Bautista. Bautista Shaina May L. with high honors. Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jolito M. Bautista. Baisa Sharmilove V. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cernante A. Baisa. Castillo Lexis Linaica L. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ramon P. Castillo Jr. Kayabyab Vanessa M. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bongbong M. Kayabyab. Di Guzman Di Jenny D. with high honors, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dennis L. Di Guzman. Di Guzman Glycel F. with high honors, Science Wizard, Pop Ed Quizzer, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mrs. Gloria F. Di Guzman. Di Guzman Kim Saina S. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo M. Di Guzman. De la Cruz Riza Rose P. with honors, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Berhelio DJ de la Cruz. De Los Santos Aileen L. with high honors, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joey S. De Los Santos. Jolazo Wendy Jen P. with honors, Eugenio's Feature Writer of the Year, English, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin M. Jolazo. Dreo Adara Jane C. with high honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Salvi Mark C. Dreo. Enrique Hannah P. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario F. Enrique. Gregorio Cassandra May C. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlo V. Gregorio. Lozano Micaela Jane M. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sergio M. Lozano. Mangale Marian Zarina B. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando G. Mangale. Melendez Trixie L. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador C. Melendez. Mercado Andrea D. with honors, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arlito Mercado. Muñoz Mayla L. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jonicio M. Muñoz. Patungan Jonilyn M. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Tomas U. Patungan Jr. Pukis Fredelyn S. with honors, Girl Scout of the Year, Semper Fidelis Award, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Pukis. Puyawan Honey Len A. with high honors, Science Wizard, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo M. Puyawan. Kiambao Laarni L. with high honors, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lauro A. Kiambao. Reyes Irish C. with high honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy R. Reyes. Salomon Bernadette A. with honors, Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfie B. Salomon. Sanchez Ira Jersey D. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Edwin S. Sanchez. Soriano Crisabel Marie V. with honors, Girl Scout of the Year. As the RRM Leader of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo C. Soriano. Viray Irish Jane D. with high honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Viray. Vistro Angeline T. with high honors, Girl Scout of the Year. Outstanding SSG Officer of the Year, SSG Got Talent First Runner-Up National Leadership Training, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Carlos C. Vistro. Yanes Hannah Grace C. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan M. Yanes.
Grade 10 Gold Completer, Advisor, Mr. Bernard Z. De Guzman. Angeles Aljon Paul J. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Junicio Angeles. Bataan Russell Floren V. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand P. Bataan. Kabatbat Kern Brent V. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Christopher P. Kabatbat. Kapitli Sir William Lawrence T. with honors, son of Miss Martina Maristela A. Chong.
Cardenio III Fernando Aldrin H., son of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando S. Cardenio Jr.
Kayabyab Ryan Michael V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ryan D. Kayabyab.
Clave Angelo V.S. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Terzon P. Clave. Fernandez Arnel A. with honors, Boy Scout of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Armando S. Fernandez. Gutierrez Aljon V. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Alejo T. Gutierrez. Patungan Barrel Lester C. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry N. Patungan. Breskid MJ C. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ramon D. Breskid. Risuelio Ivan Cyrus M. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Manolo D. Risuelio. Reyes Anthony Joseph D. with honors, Sports Awardee Volleyball, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose R. Reyes. Rosario Jethro Aidan Lee P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Randy F. Rosario. Sanchez Mark Jerome M. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. George S. Sanchez. Saison Jonel D. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Dante S. Saison. Valdez Timothy Jonathan G. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin C. Valdez. Ventura Charles Luis V. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Armando M. Ventura. Acosta Eliza Mia P. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur A. Acosta. Aquino Lanalee Maxine R. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Orlando L. Aquino. Bandong Micah Nicole F. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario C. Bandong. Baniked Kyle Alessandra S. with honors,
daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand B. Baniken. Bautista Febri Hershey L. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Boots Q. Bautista. Vermal Katrina B. with honors, Semper Fidelis Award, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold A. Bermal. Rungay Maria Feliz L. Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mrs. Milagros L. Karungay. Katunggal Julina May M. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Saldi Katunggal. De Vera Fredelin T. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Freddy R. De Vera. De Vera Jennifer C. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio R. De Vera. De Los Santos Roxanne M. with honors, Semper Fidelis Award, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo C. De Los Santos Jr. Dumo Bridget Cameron R. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ponciano F. Dumo. Edradan Cherry Ann P. with honors, daughter of Mrs. Violeta P. Edradan. Finolyar Lovely Ann B. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Hinaro Finolyar. Marceliano Renalyn Y. with honors, daughter of Mrs. Jelly R. Marceliano. Navarro Bea H. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Walter A. Navarro. Valesco Jennifer V. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sinilo C. Olesco. Orebilio Zairiel May M. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Philip M. Orebilio. Peralta Shane May C. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jolios B. Peralta. Risuelio Dublin Claire C. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alan B. Risuelio. Risuelio Eliza Jane R. with honors, Semper Fidelis Award, SSG Got Talent First Runner-Up, National Leadership Training, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo M. Risuelio. Reyes Gwyneth Danielle L. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo M. Reyes Jr. Reyes Nina Marie D. with honors, daughter of Miss Susana D. Reyes. Rosario J. Ann Marie T. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph A. Rosario. Sabaluca Monica Nina R. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Raymel Q. Sabaluca. Sandoval Charlene Shane D. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cecilio A. Sandoval. Tuwayon Rothmarie Z. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo Tuwayon.
Grade 10 Ruby Completers Advisor Mr. Michael F. Bandong. Alvarez J. Ralph N. son of Mr. and Mrs. Roderick Alvarez. Aquino Jeric V. son of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Aquino Jr. Bacani John Anderson P. son of Mr. and Mrs. Joey Bacani. Bautista Cyrus John S. son of Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Bautista. Beltran Nathaniel F. son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Beltran. Caranto Zeno M. son of Mr. and Mrs. Regino Caranto. De Guzman Erwin M., Boy Scout of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Agripino de Guzman. De Luna Isaac Gilmore D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Tito George Tan. De la Cruz Daniel G., Boy Scout of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Delphine de la Cruz. De la Cruz Mark Samuel H., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel de la Cruz. De la Cruz Rafael P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Robert de la Cruz. Prias Rester John R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Prias. Garcia Jordan S., son of Mr. and Mrs. John Garcia. Harilio Mark Ron D., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Harilio. Macaraag Russell Jan P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Macaraag. Montemayor Kim John P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Johnny Montemayor. Ordoña James Bernadette D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eddie Ordoña. Pascual Lee Jan C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romel Pascual. Resultan Christian Jules D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Julius Resultan. Rosario Jan Verwin P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Rosario. Tamayo Alberto Jr. A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Tamayo Sr. Tamayo John Kenneth S., Outstanding Cadet of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Tamayo. Umali Jopet G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ritnato Umali. Valdez Gabriel P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Valdez. Ventura Christian D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Carlito Ventura. Avas Juanesha L., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Jamil Abbas. Adviento Jade R., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Adviento. Ballesteros Romela and Angel M., daughter of Mrs. Milagrosa Ballesteros. Barongan Fayan M., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Regan Barungan. De Vera W. R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernard De Vera. De Vera Lovely Joy R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernard Vera. Domingo Eliza D., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Domingo. Gilie Mary Rose I., daughter of Mrs. Rosemary Gilie. Matias Ella P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sergio Matias. Haraino Jillian Prinzi I., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel Paraino. Perez Angela Jade A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Perez. Quinto Christine May P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Quinto. Rosario Azali D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Rosario. Rosario Bernadette Rose P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Artemio Rosario. Urbano Isusa Marie M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Urbano.
Grade 10 Copper Completers. Advisor, Mr. Jose Armando B. Malikdem.
Ambanloc Clyde A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Ambanloc. Arambolo Raymond A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Arambolo. Banyes Mark Raven P., Sports Awardee, son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Banyes. Carino Art Jensen G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo Carino. Castro Earl Marion A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricky Castro. De Guzman Gerald A., Athlete of the Year, Outstanding Cadet of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto De Guzman. Diaz Brandon Jake F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Diaz. Doria Kais Reed B., Outstanding Cadet of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Kim Doria. Ferrer Maui C. A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Ferrer. Gubatan King Dominic S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Gubatan. Ligada Jimir R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Ligada. Likwanan Raymond D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Elpidio Likwanan. Merera Mark Joshua L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Merera. Perez Stephen Lloyd V., Athlete of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Perez. Quijano John Dave D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Luel Quijano. Ramos Mark Charles Jesus C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Ramos. Rosario John Patrick R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Rosario. Salvador Mark Kevin P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Raimundo Salvador. Sermonia Sanji A., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Alex Sermonia. C. Howard C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Henry C. Vicente John Alvin C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Julian Vicente. Alberto Jenny D., guardian Miss Millones Reyes. Amor Jolibel Supia D., with honors, Best in Calligraphy, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan Amor Jr. Aquino Catherine Claudette C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Aquino. Aquino Rona May, daughter of Miss Connie Aquino. Arenas Jamaica R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jojo Arenas. Kabuday Yasmin M., with honors, Eugenio's News Writer of the Year, English, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Elizarde Kabuday. Calano Maria Gracie May P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Alan Calano. Cano Bianca Kylie D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Cano. The twin Althea Ella May V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alan the twin. Gutierrez Maria Teresa S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Gutierrez. Marceliano Daisy M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Marceliano. Usadas Judihana D., Girl Scout of the Year, Eugenio's Best Female News Reporter, Filipino, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Pusadas. Recto Eliza Mika R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Oliver Recto. Rosario Nicole A., Best in Poster Making, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel Rosario. Tomas Jessica P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Tomas. Balesterol Cristel Joy C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Balesterol.
Grade 10 Quartz Completers. Advisor, Mrs. Sonia C. Jola. Aquino Darwin R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Junicio Aquino. Bautista Paul Gabriel A., Boy Scout of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Pipito M. Bautista. Bautista Richard C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manny B. Bautista. Carino Benvenido Ray J., son of Mr. and Mrs. George P. Carino. Katanawan Art Brian R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nolly G. Katanawan. De Guzman J.R.A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Cipriano De Guzman. De Guzman Rainier John D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo B. De Guzman. De la Cruz Eldon John D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfo V. De la Cruz. De Ocampo Anthony Carl A., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Francisco De Ocampo. Diaz Charles Hamilton F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Loreto C. Diaz. Fernandez Jimboy P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Sergio Fernandez. Fernandez Mark Anthony D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Fernandez. Ferrer Ralph D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ramil G. Ferrer. Mangabo Denver John V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eugenio P. Mangabo. Ramos Eric Von M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bonifacio Ramos. Risuelio Joffrey A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Armando Risuelio. Risuelio Raniel L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio P. Risuelio. Sanchez Mark F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manny M. Sanchez. Season Samuel Louis C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel T. Season. Soriano Kevin J., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo M. Soriano. Ursua Marco J. D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando C. Ursua. Garcia Rosalinda C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lauro S. Garcia. Malikdam Christine M., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin E. Malikdam. Talisaysay Ella May G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Elizardo B. Talisaysay. Valerio Daisy May C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo E. Valerio. Grade 10 Meteorite Completers. Advisor, Mr. Romeo S. Santos. Agustin Mark Joseph G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Agustin. Austria Romel Glenn A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Hermogeno R. Austria. Bacani Kurt Vincent P., SDRRM Leader of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Abelardo Bacani. Bacani Theo T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin M. Bacani. Castro Jamson S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Castro. De Guzman Christopher T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto A. de Guzman Sr. De Guzman Danmark M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel L. de Guzman. De Guzman Ernest Fernan N., Outstanding Cadet of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernabe S. de Guzman. De Guzman Yuri A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eleucadio de Guzman. De Guzman Luke Joshua G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lamberto de Guzman. De Guzman Rovic D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo de Guzman. De Guzman Vinix Aisen T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael M. de Guzman. De Vera Ryan C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo B. de Vera. Del Prado Lawrence P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel S. Del Prado. Diaz Brian John E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Silverio Diaz. Donius Aaron Paul L., Semper Fidelis Award, son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo V. Dunius. Dumo Adrian Alan Lee D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Fred Dumo. Ferrer Mark Alistair S., son of Mr. and Mrs. William G. Ferrer. Gutierrez Skid C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Gutierrez Jr. Legaspi Gilbert P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Legaspi. Martinez Jamison T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joel C. Martinez. Palisok John Harvey D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Harold C. Palisok. Parayawan JVD, Sports Awardee, Sepak Takraw, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy D. Parayawan. Salazar Ralph Lawrence R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricky B. Salazar. Solteo John Paul Y., son of Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto Solteo. Soriano Aaron A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Artemio R. Soriano. Terrazola Arwin R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo D. Terrazola. Barlaan Jamaica M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo M. Barlaan. Soriano Myra Camille S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Yulo G. Soriano. Valdez Mirabelli Gracia D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador V. Valdez.
Great Plan Uranium Computers, Advisory, Mrs. Jocelyn D. Malikdam. Austria Jomari M., son of Mr. and Mrs. James Austria. Bataan Aldrin P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro Bataan. Beltran Florence J. D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Beltran. Cabuang Kenneth C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Julius Cabuang. Castro Jordan R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Valentino Castro. De Guzman Roger Jr. R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roger de Guzman Sr. Delphine Justin D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nolly Delphine. Espinoza Johnny R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Elpidio Reyes. Grama Mark Ivan D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernard Grama. Guantero Almer R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Guantero. Lumibaw Tyrone B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Lumibaw. Madula Gijon P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Herman Madula. Marquez Heron Jem S. with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Marquez. Mendoza Edwin Jr. G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Mendoza Sr. Munoz Joshua B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Munoz. Parayawan Andrew O., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mateo Parayawan. Patungan Rodan B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Patungan Sr. Perez Axelros M., son of Mrs. Sandra Perez. Resuelio Dames G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Resuelio. Reyes Justin J.R., son of Mr. and Mrs. George Reyes. Rosario Rainer Andre M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Rosario. Sanchez Raymart D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rizaldo Sanchez. Season Mar Sherwin F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Season. Soriano Florence Day B., Athlete of the Year, Wushu, son of Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo Soriano. Tamundong Aljan C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Filomeno Tamundong. Kabway Gladly C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Hermogeno Kabway. Cancino Sunday C., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel Cancino. The Coco Cheska G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcos the Coco. The Ligdig Mary Grace B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus the Ligdig. Dayaw Mary Garcia M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Dayaw. Estrada Melanie B., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Melchor Estrada. Garcia Abigail B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Boyet Garcia. Hermoso Mary Laika Jade S., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Laureto Hermoso. Harillo Maryjoy D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Felipe Harillo. Paningbatan Maylin B., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Paningbatan. Pidlawan Maryjoy D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cipriano Pidlawan Jr. Resuelio Brenda M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Resuelio. Soriano Julina D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Soriano Jr. Soto Rosemary S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Soto. Untalan Maria Isabel T., with honors, Athlete of the Year, Sepak Takraw. Daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Untalan. Villaluz Angel Ann, daughter of Mrs. Christine D. Villaluz. Grade 10 Jade Completers. Advisory, Mrs. Milagros L. Carungay. Ambanlok Martin Amiel R., Boy Scout of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlo Ambanlok. Castillo Macray Gabriel P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Renate Castillo. Colera John Paul J., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo Colera. De Vera Jerome F., son of Mrs. Arlene Fernandez. Ferrer John Carlo M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Ferrer. Fulgencio Bernard John C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Fulgencio. Lumibaw Miko J. M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Modesto Lumibaw. Martin Justin T., Sports Awardee, Basketball, son of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Martin. Perez RGV, son of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando Perez. Salazar Jason L., son of Mr. and Mrs. George Salazar. Tamundong James S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Tamundong. Aguilando Valentina S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Saturnino Aguilando. Andrade Ivan Ash, daughter of Mrs. Femari Andrade. Aquino Christine May T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Aquino. Aquino Kyla T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benigno Aquino. Campus Nicole M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Campus. Cana Jazel O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gaspar Cano. Castro Adeliza P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Castro. Kayabyab Jasmine C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Kayabyab. De Guzman Jana Patricia M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador de Guzman. De Guzman Jonabel P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo de Guzman Jr. De Guzman Rogelyn R., Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio de Guzman. De Los Santos Noemi J., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime de los Santos. Fisher Cherlin C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sonia Fisher. Junio May and D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Junio Jr. Husgaya Jeline M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcos Husgaya. Mabanglo Sheila May S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Mabanglo. Marceliana Jovelyn F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Marceliano. Munoz Laika R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Efren Munoz. Pagdanganan Tricia May P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sandy Pagdanganan. Parangat Rosal Morgan T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Russell Parangat. Peralta Gisela Shane D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Abraham Peralta Jr. Peralta Rochelle C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Peralta Sr. Ponce Joan A., daughter of Mrs. Angeline Ponce. Repudas Janelle B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gisdalo Repudas. Risuelio Alexa P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex Risuelio. Reyes Giselle P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Reyes. Saison Jessamay A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Saison. Tigno Monica H., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario M. Tigno. Grade 10 Opal Completers. Advisor, Mrs. Rosalia S. Risuelio. Kabansag King Paulo R., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo Cabansag. Castro Gerard S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Castro. Castro Ivan M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Brando Castro. Cortez Kristen J. S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Cortez. De Guzman Joan Jr. C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joan de Guzman Sr. De Guzman John Carlo O., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo de Guzman. De Vera Jomer M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy De Vera. De la Cruz John Paul M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo de la Cruz. De la Cruz Reynaldo Jr. C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo de la Cruz Sr. De los Santos Denver C., son of Mrs. Liberty de los Santos. De los Santos Dexter C., son of Mrs. Liberty de los Santos. De los Santos James P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose de los Santos. Stanislao Gendry, son of Miss Janet Stanislao. Francisco Brian D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Renato Francisco. Liamas Lance Angelo M., son of Mrs. Marites Liamas. Lungkop Jerome E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Lungkop. Lopez Ernesto III B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Lopez Jr. Magleo Demarc A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Dante Magleo. Malikdam Darwin B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Isagani Malikdam. Morano Jim D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Morano. Munoz Mark Russell G., Outstanding Cadet of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rolly Munoz. Orgil Jomari C., son of Miss Maria Victoria Orgil. Puyawan Prince Paulo T., son of Miss Jenny Timbol. Reyes Bill Harrison A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Reyes. Rosario Larry Jr. R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry Rosario Sr. Rosario Richard A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Rosario. Sanchez Raymond John F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Sanchez. Season E.J. Rovick P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Season. Soriano Aldrin M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnoldo Soriano. Soriano Erickson B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mike Soriano. Tamayo Yance Yuan L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry Tamayo. Valerio MacNeil M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reggie Valerio. Villa Kristen P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Villa. Gonzalez Mary Grace M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Gonzalez. Labasan Jocelyn C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joselito Labasan. Ventimiglia Isa Luis R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico Ventimiglia.
Grade 10 Granite Completers. Advisor, Mrs. Mirasol R. Zacarias. Abay Jason A., the son of Mrs. Loretta A. Abay. Crisostomo Lawrence R., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario C. Crisostomo. Rosario K.C.R., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo V. Rosario. Aquino K.C.R., Girl Scout of the Year, the daughter of Mrs. Lolita R. Aquino. Austria Arabella B., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Austria. Austria Jasmine D., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marley A. Austria. Bautista Diana Fatima R., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gabriel P. Bautista. Cañada Glyza R., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose A. Cañada. Castro Janelle Z., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George B. Castro. Crisostomo Jonashel L., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Renato C. Crisostomo. Cristobal Janelle C., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marvin P. Cristobal. De Guzman Dory May D., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Tiburcio L. De Guzman. De Vera Shobi Lay M., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan C. De Vera. De La Cruz Joyce Q., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan P. De La Cruz. De Los Santos Shane Carla D., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bonnie A. De Los Santos. Diaz Jacqueline O., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Policarpio D. Diaz Jr. Elefanio Jessamine O., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jovelino S. Elefanio. Ferrer Jasmine D., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose C. Ferrer. Ferrer J.M.Q., the daughter of Mrs. Joan Q. Ferrer. Ferrer Marvick M. Rose Q., the daughter of Mrs. Joan Q. Ferrer. Ferrer Shanna Y., Simster of the Year, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cesar Charles D. Ferrer. Gural Janeline P., the daughter of Mrs. Julita Gural. Gutierrez Christine Lee R., Girl Scout of the Year, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo P. Gutierrez. Jarillo Julie Ana A., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo C. Jarillo. Lau Micaela Rose F., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael F. Lau. Macam Jessica B., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sonny D. Macam. Malikda Maria Angelica C., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario L. Malikdam. Malikdam Ruberiza C., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio D. Malikdam. Martinez Crisa Inueli P., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio P. Martinez. Menor Janine S., Eugenia's Best Female News Reporter, English, Girl Scout of the Year, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cesario M. Menor. Miranda Ira Marie D., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo M. Miranda. Nicolas Ferlin Jesha L., Girl Scout of the Year, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico A. Nicolas. Pundan Mary Rose G., the daughter of Mrs. Jurley M. Pundan. Rosario Annabel M., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dante R. Rosario. Rosario Jamaica P., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie C. Rosario. Sanchez Daryl Natalie O., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Calvin A. Sanchez. Sanchez Eliza Faye S., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Felipe P. Sanchez. Sibayan Mageline P., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nelson B. Sibayan. Sullivan Jenny F., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo M. Sullivan. Solomon Erica May D., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nelson D. Solomon. Soriano Micaela A., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alexius A. Soriano. Tulagan Joy Ann S., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Tulagan. Grade 10 Topaz Completers Advisor, Mrs. Mary Grace C. Amansek. Agapito Hans David C., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Serviliano F. Agapito. Agbuya Piolo D., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto S. Agbuya. Alcantara Reggie M., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Z. Alcantara. Beltran Jason F., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime R. Beltran. Cancino T.J. Sander T., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro C. Cancino. Carino Justin Jake, the son of Miss Jacqueline R. Carino. Carrera Hans Julian C., the son of Mr. and Mrs. June F. Carrera. Casilagan John Bert M., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Randy Casilagan. Cayetano Lawrence L., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon M. Cayetano. De Guzman Adrian M., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Elarde M. De Guzman. De Vera Mark Hill C., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Gary A. De Vera. De la Cruz Aljon R., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo R. De la Cruz. De la Cruz John Luis S., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Alex M. De la Cruz. Dumalanta John Carl C., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Sonny B. Dumalanta. Espinoza John Gerald M., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Marshall P. Espinoza. Fermin Dante S., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Danielle C. Fermin. Fernandez Anthony M., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnulfo F. Fernandez. Ferrer James Russell D., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime C. Ferrer. Frias Matt Jenred B., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Joel D. Frias. Intal Ryan C., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto S. Intal Sr. Juan Renz Harvey S., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Dennis D. Juan. Lumibao Mark Andrew G., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin D. Lumibao. Pascual Lester G., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie B. Pascual. Peralta Jerome J., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Lito V. Peralta. Prado John Lester D., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo B. Prado. Risuelio John Michael A., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Roger P. Risuelio. Rosario Arnel M., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo L. Rosario. Rosario Crisanto Z., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon M. Rosario. Sarmiento Resty D., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Richard P. Sarmiento. Saison Jovan V., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo A. Saison. Soriano Adrian V., the son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo C. Soriano. Aquino Giselle E., the daughter of Miss Rowena E. Aquino. Iones Yasmin D., Athlete of the Year, Basketball Girls 5x5, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo C. Iones. Bacani Belinda E., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Freddie M. Bacani Sr. Brillo Mary Joy D., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joey A. Brillo. Cortez Cassandra Nicole N., the daughter of Miss Arlene N. Cortez. De Vera Justine Nicole D., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Conrado M. De Vera. Ferrer Jenny Babes P., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo D. Ferrer. Gutierrez Angelica D., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Willie D. Gutierrez. Hilario Mary Marville A., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ramon M. Hilario. Octit Angelica T., with honors, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernabe M. Octit. Padlan Andrea A., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Andres R. Padlan. Puyawan Jamaica C., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Julian C. Puyawan Jr. Repudas Sofia B., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Diosdado M. Repudas. Resuelio Rowella R., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald M. Resuelio. Soriano Rhea P., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Efren L. Soriano. Valerio Angelica C., the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador D. Valerio.
Grade 10 Nickel Completers. Advisor, Mr. Jerry A. Brison. Castro Angelo Miguel R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael L. Castro. Cayabyab Christian R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roger A. Cayabyab. De Guzman Kirby Junel M., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Reggie D. De Guzman. De la Cruz John Frey G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey P. De la Cruz. Jola Mar Lawrence M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marciana D. Jola. Yadid John Ray L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Raimundo Jadid. Forbile Wilfredo Jr. T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Sr. Forville. Kabuyan Jericho P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Cesario C. Kabuyan. Gutierrez Erickson D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Herberto S. Gutierrez. Manuel Danred R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Manuel. Miranda Alexander A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito C. Miranda. Mondares Justin George R., son of Mr. and Mrs. George M. Mondares. Munoz Joshua Philip C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joel O. Munoz. Padlan Ian R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Padlan. Pagsulingan John Mark M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo P. Pagsulingan. Rovillos John Michael R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Tony V. Rovillos. Sanchez Richard A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio D. Sanchez. Saplan Jamil D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jessie Saplan. Soriano E.J. M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edgar L. Soriano. Soriano Wilson P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador J. Soriano. Valdez Rafael V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roque V. Valdez. Benluan Richard Z., son of Mr. and Mrs. Josemar P. Benluan. Cabansag Baby Lou A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo Cabansag. Castro Alexa Bianca T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex D. Castro. Katungal Lorilyn Yu, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Loreto P. Katungal. De Guzman Ginalyn P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Guillermo M. De Guzman. De la Cruz Micaela G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto P. De la Cruz. De Los Santos Mary Jane P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Miguel M. De Los Santos. Gilling Roxanne A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roland D. Gilling. Lambino Abigail P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marshall Lambino. Macaraeg Julian P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo P. Macaraeg. Marquez Riza H., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Abdul Rahman Marquez. Marquez Victoria Jane L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Victorino C. Marquez. Miranda Natasha S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Richard L. Miranda. Parayawan Marjorie R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Enrique D. Parayawan. Risuelio Rizan Joy M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo D. Risuelio. Tamundong Francine May R., daughter of Mrs. Marlene Tamundong. Tamundong Jonah Grace, daughter of Mrs. Marilyn Tamundong. Tommy Mary Jane A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Carlito M. Tome. Grade 10 Amethyst Completers. Advisor, Mrs. Carmelita I. Maglia. Arenas Johnson D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo B. Arenas. Pato Jack Daniel B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael B. Pato. Peralta John Christopher D., sports awardee, son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon B. Peralta. Peralta Mario Jr. B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Maria V. Peralta. Pukis Abraham P., son of Mrs. Marlin P. Pukis. Rigondola John Christopher B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Christopher C. Rigondola. Risuelio Berlita C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benji G. Risuelio. Risuelio Jr. Conrado D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Conrado V. Risuelio Sr. Rosario Samuel L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Juan G. Rosario. Season Caleb S., with honors, Outstanding Cadet of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. David D. Season. Tamayo Kevin B., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Q. Tamayo. Tamundong John Mike S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael B. Tamundong. Andal Princess A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Andrew M. Andal. Aquino Jasmine D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romy S. Aquino. Banyaga Angela M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo S. Banyaga. Kabida Michelle Ariane M., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eugenia V. Kabida. Castro Kathleen May P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo S. Castro. De Luna R.V. R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald M. De Luna. De la Cruz Jamaica A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gistonin P. De la Cruz. Dumalanta Rica P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo P. Dumalanta. Antila Catherine C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dante L. Intila. Espique Rupi Cyril G., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando T. Espique. Ferrer Joselle Ann T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Philemon M. Ferrer Jr. Ferrer Sunshine M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio A. Ferrer. Gurion Shane Chai G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando M. Gurion. Oleika Krista May F., daughter of Mrs. Edita F. Oleika. Pasawa Camille Ann D., sports awardee, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel F. Pasawa. Pastor Tricia May Ann M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Johnny L. Pastor. Pidlawan Raina Carmela S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ryan M. Pidlawan. Ramos Rubelin B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ruben M. Ramos. Risuelio Judy Ann D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo V. Risuelio. Reyes Mary Grace C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo R. Reyes. Soriano Maria Andrea P., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lawton D. Soriano. Soriano Mariel K. L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino T. Soriano Jr. Soto Micaela G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romel E. Soto. Tablizo Daniela P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sammy B. Tablizo. Tablizo Ruela Ann V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolly P. Tablizo. Tamayo Jasly Han B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roger D. Tamayo. Tambuyat Charmaine T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto D. Tambuyat. Valerio Jeneline O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gilberto B. Valerio. Ventinilla Geraldine P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jessie C. Ventinilla. Vinluan Brigitte P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edgar P. Vinluan.
Grayton Ivory Completers, Advisor, Mrs. Margie B. Magat. Apostol John Rex S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Apostol. Calibozo Jerome C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Calibozo Jr. Capito Jerome Clint P., with honors, son of Mrs. Leia Capito. Dacanay Patrick Mark A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Perfecto Dacanay. De Guzman Lawrence D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Anthony De Guzman. Dulay Earl Paulo T., with honors, son of Mrs. Maria Wilma T. Dulay. Ferrer Tristan Kurt B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mayolan Ferrer. Garcia Alexander G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Luis Garcia. Gonzalez Harold Jigen Y., with honors, Homemaker of the Year, son of Mr. and Mrs. John Gonzalez Jr. Mendoza Nico B., Sports Awardee Volleyball, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Mendoza. Padlan J. Lloyd C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Padlan Jr. Padua Amarthon Cloud C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Padua. Posadas Adams Jefferson E., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Adonis Posadas. Rosuelio Bryce Aison D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jess Rosuelio. Romero John Lloyd V., son of Mrs. Lucia V. Romero. Serenas Ashley Manuel M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ariel Serenas. Season Alvijan S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alfie Season. Soriano Ashley Z.,
son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Soriano. Aquino Maria Wangeline, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wendell Aquino. Bandong Alisa A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cristobal Bandong. Carino Micaela M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Philip Carino. Climaco Kelly Ann Joy P., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benji T. Climaco. Escanio Princess F., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Escanio. Fulgencio Rochelle M., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Noel Fulgencio. Garcia Jamay S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Billy Garcia. Gandayaw Shaira T., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ruel Gandayaw. Herrero Marilu R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Herrero. Junio Maria Elizabeth M., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reggie Junio. Lapitan Andrea Jamila C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Lapitan. Macaraeg Giselle Ann R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Macaraeg. Malikdam Mary Joy A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Orlando Malikdam. Mangalyag Jamaica G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Felix Mangalyag. Marceliano Maybelline G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Marceliano. Munoz Christine Joy J., with honors, Homemaker of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Munoz. Munoz Maria Isabel A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand B. Munoz. Padua Rashin Zaira B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rudy Padua. Resuelio Josephine A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Resuelio. Resuelio Micaela R., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Resuelio. Rosario Eliza May C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro M. Rosario. Rosario Amariza, with honors, daughter of Mr. Alan Ballesteros. Taliser Shane D.G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Taliser. Villaruz Mika Asahel M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Villaruz. Vinluan Beverly P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arnel F. Vinluan. Grade 10 Zonal Completers, Advisor, Mr. Virgilio R. Jola. Bautista Alfis C., son of Mrs. Gloria C. Bautista. Beltran John Lester C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Loreto B. Beltran. Kayabyab Kempi D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio R. Kayabyab. Cruz John Mark T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Martin V. Cruz. De Guzman John Russell C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Johnson M. De Guzman. De Vera Adonis B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo G. De Vera. De Los Santos born Mark Q., son of Mr. and Mrs. Orlando O. De Los Santos. Diaz Efren D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo C. Diaz. Gutierrez Mark Gabriel M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Raul F. Gutierrez. Lapida Michael D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Anthony P. Lapida. Matabang Brian Jeff G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlino E. Matabang. Mondares Clarence P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Crispin Z. Mondares. Munoz Jefferson G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Robert P. Munoz. Padlan Charles A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo A. Padlan. Reyes Russian D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rani M. Reyes. Roman Brian D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio R. Roman. Rosario Jovan A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Diosdado R. Rosario. Sabinorio Oliver A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Orlando O. Sabinorio. Sale Craig Zacchaeus L., son of Mr. and Mrs. J. T. Sale. Saison Joshua M., Athlete of the Year Wushu, son of Mr. and Mrs. Manny A. Saison. Soriano Mark Jubert D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Dewey U. Soriano. Soriano Policarpo Jr. R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Policarpo Soriano Sr. Austria Crizame B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo C. Austria. De Vera Cherry Ann E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonard R. De Vera. Delphine Edame D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo L. Delphine. Paragas Jonabel R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph C. Paragas. Tamayo Rica Marie Z., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rickson M. Tamayo.
Grade 10 Krypton Completers. Advisor, Mrs. Minda M. Abula. Aquino Lloyd Absidy R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry S. Aquino. Austria Jonathan S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry D. Austria. Austria Kurt Russell H., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lyndon C. Austria. Kabwai James Allen A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy M. Kabwai. Ferrer Adrian B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo N. Ferrer. Haradal Frederick James P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Floreto B. Haradal. Mercado Julius Cesar A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Carmichael D. Mercado. Peralta R.J. M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nexon M. Peralta. Alcantara Kate Ann M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dexter C. Alcantara. Aquino Annabel R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro Aquino. Aquino May Kayla B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael M. Aquino. Beltran Vanessa Y., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ruben Beltran. Kabwang Trixie C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Julius P. Kabwang. Cardenio Nicole Ashley T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Emilio Cardenio Jr. Castro Kimberly D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reggie Castro. Catulos Diane F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Catulos. Kayabyab Angelica M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Freddy A. Kayabyab. Fernandez September Jean S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Glenn J. Fernandez. Ikay Jana Maria Z., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo A. Ikay. Harillo Melinda D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Felipe Harillo Jr. Mamaril Estela Marie C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Randy B. Mamaril. Manangan Sofia Hayat C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando B. Manangan. Marceliano Janice O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cesario Marceliano. Matabang Camille D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo P. Matabang. Merdihia Mariel, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Linimar Mondacruz. Munoz Hanilin P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Munoz. Munoz Rochelle R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Raimundo Munoz. Palaganas Virginia C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex A. Palaganas. Parayawan Jonah B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodelio M. Parayawan. Rosario Monica R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo Rosario. Saison Sarah May R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernabe V. Saison. Soriano Shinalin C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo C. Soriano. G10 Silver Completers, Advisor, Mrs. Amalia C. Garcia. Alvarez Justin Kurt U., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph D. Alvarez. Bartolome Benji, son of Mrs. Josephine D. Bartolome. Benitez John Paul B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Francisco S. Benitez. Cancino Jamir Rim M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Orlis S. Cancino. Munoz Mark D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael J. Munoz. Aguera Charmaine E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael D. Aguera. Aquino Erica May C., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin P. Aquino. Aquino Jason R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus P. Aquino. Aquino Yesamen Kisaya, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Erguiza Jr. Bandong Alaina May A., daughter of Mrs. Lauren A. Bandong. Bautista Rochelle P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rusty D. Bautista. Bugayong Hazel Ann L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro T. Bugayong. Costudio Cherubel G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo T. Costudio. Dakasin Ayen B., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon C. Dakasin. Dayaw Mary Ann M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo A. Dayaw. Diaz Angelica A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Abraham A. Diaz. Diaz Nina Nizel M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Diaz. Francisco Jamaira Lexin A., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph D. Francisco. Gillier Jesslyn P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joey C. Gillier. Gilling Venus D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pepito D. Gilling. Lorca Jessica D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James L. Lorca. Magleo Angelica M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo C. Magleo. Malyari Maria Monique A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador G. Malyari. Marceliano Ana Marie T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel R. Marceliano. Mondares Barbie N., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John P. Mondares. Moreno Shane Monique S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto P. Moreno. Kaita Ashley Nicole D., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo M. Kaita. Rote Irina Kyla R., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Rote. Samara Laika C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Armando D. Samara. Soriano Althea Michelle R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alan S. Soriano. Omali Denise Grisel G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Omali Jr. Binoya Rochelle N., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert C. Binoya. Zacarias Kyla May D., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Z. Zacarias.
10 Sapphire Completers, Advisor Cecilia D. Santos. Aboy John Mars C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Aboy. Awit Cassie Arden R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Philip Cesar Awit. Baroa Abi Horaira D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Abdul Manap Y. Baroa. Carillo Kier D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lito Carillo. Carino Mark Anthony G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rafael G. Carino II. Doria Alexander Michael John, son of Mrs. Mary Jane D. Albarida. Reyes Tyron R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Janicio Reyes. Aquino Angelica Z., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernabe Aquino. Aquino Clarice S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico Aquino. Aquino Jasmine Bernadette R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Armando Aquino. Austria Maria Eliza M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlito M. Austria. Bozon Sofia Bianca P., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo P. Bozon. Beltran Harley Venice L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Beltran. Kabuay Lovely Queen C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Herman P. Kabuay. Castro Michelle S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Castro. Kayaban Zai Rel C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Kayaban. Cuevas Bernadette C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Felicissimo Cuevas. De Guzman Micaela D., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo P. De Guzman. De Guzman Micaela D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan M. De Guzman. De la Cruz Thea Jevan F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey De La Cruz. De Los Santos Angel D., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Noel De Los Santos. De Los Santos China D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo D. De Los Santos. Ferrer Karen M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Ferrer. Ferrer Natalia Gwen F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Milo Ferrer. Frias Ellen K. T., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alberto M. Frias. Galicia Abigail Samantha T. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin E. Galicia. Gonzales Blessed Darlene Eunice B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernie Gonzales. Gutierrez Neraiza B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ray Gutierrez. Lavarias Crystal May A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edmondo Lavarias. Lumboy Kyla P., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Carlito Lumboy. Macaraeg Princess Yisha B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Louis Macaraeg. Mamaligsa Patricia D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Louis Mamaligsa. Manzon Barbie Jamara C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Janicio Manzon. Menor Vanessa R., daughter of Mrs. Francisca Menor. Munoz Revelyn C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Revelando Munoz. Padilla Franz Erica C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Elmer Padilla. Paris Precious Jane P., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Paris. Perez Jamaica Lydell B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Delphine Perez. Regaspi April Ann C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Julian C. Regaspi. Rosario Jennifer R., daughter of Mrs. Gina Rosario. Sabino Jocelyn C., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo Sabino Jr. Sarmiento Kimberly Cassandra C., with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex Sarmiento. Segundo Mary Ann N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Sevillano Segundo. Tamundong Angela May B., with honors, daughter of Mrs. Mayra Tamundong. Tamundong Portia May D., with honors, daughter of Mrs. Virginia T. Munoz. Orion Rowena V., daughter of Mrs. Adelina Orion.
Grade 10 Bronze Completers, Advisor, Mrs. Gloria R. Fernando. Esteban Juni Marco O., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario D. Esteban. Gonzales R.J. Nas L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ariston R. Gonzales. Lumboy Daniel F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edward P. Lumboy. Mamaradlo Jefferson C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Misael D. Mamaradlo. Nabua Christian J.G., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Camilo Jr. D. Nabua. Jamar Glenn Jester B., with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus S. Uchimar. Pinullar William J. M., son of Mr. and Mrs. William F. Pinullar. Rosario Adrian E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo B. Rosario. Sapera Mark John D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marcos P. Sapera. Valerio Angelo Gabriel E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernard P. Valerio. Abalos Pamela P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricky C. Abalos. Balesteros Jessel D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus M. Balesteros. Banaag Marivic F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo G. Banaag. Camacho Paulette Rhea O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Abel G. Camacho. Castro K. Ann P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo S. Castro. Cristobal Angeline G. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex C. Cristobal. Dancel Jessamay C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ramon M. Dancel. David Julina D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jolie D. David. De Guzman Ashley Nicole A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario P. De Guzman. Guzman Lalet M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo L. De Guzman. De Leon Bernadette M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand De Leon. De La Cruz Sophia S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Willie M. De La Cruz. De Los Santos Cyril Clarice with honors, daughter of Miss Jocelyn G. De Los Santos. Dison Karen May M. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Casman G. Dison. Domingo Crystal Joey E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Raspi C. Domingo. Doria Charis M., daughter of Mrs. Cecilia M. Doria. Fernandez Maria Victoria B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin A. Fernandez. Ferrer Christine Joy G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo B. Ferrer. Ferrer Jenik M. Rose Q., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mark Andrew C. Ferrer. Rias Princess Harlin R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Harold R. Rias. Garcia Angeline B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Boyet A. Garcia. Dural Abigail Ann S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Vicente C. Gural. Ico Daniel D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Raimundo D. Ico. Layakan Kayla R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gregorio T. Layakan. Murano Glenda D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo D. Murano. Munoz Kimberly Ann B., sports awardee, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry C. Munoz. Naagas Jolie Ann D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon P. Naagas. Paningbatan Vanessa B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro R. Paningbatan. Pato Francesca Francine A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando S. Pato. Peronce Arlene M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex B. Peronce. Rosario Cielo E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. David R. Rosario. Rosario Gurley D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro C. Rosario. Solomon Marjorie O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur P. Solomon. Venezuela Jenny M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin C. Venezuela. Ventura Melody M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leo Y. Ventura. Bincua Princess Nicole R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ramil T. Bincua. Zacarias Mary Grace C. with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo M. Zacarias.
And Emerald Completers, Advisor, Mrs. Cynthia F. Panuela. Andaya Michael D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio G. Andaya. Austria John Paul R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mauro M. Austria. Bautista Kenneth S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold S. Bautista. Cawile Mark James L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Fidelio D. Cawile. Cristobal Nathaniel T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo M. Cristobal. De Guzman A.J. G., son of Mr. Juanito C. De Guzman Jr. De Leon Giovanni A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Johnny C. De Leon. De Vera John Paul S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry M. De Vera. De Hero Jovan P., son of Mrs. Lorma P. De Hero. De la Cruz John Ray S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo R. De la Cruz. De la Rosa Jericho G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Christopher S. De la Rosa. Esteban Mark Angelo D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo S. Esteban. Manzon John Christopher S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Crescencio U. Manzon. Resuelio Christian T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Elpidio D. Resuelio. Rosario Brian Kenneth U., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro R. Rosario. Sanchez John Michael B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodel T. Sanchez. Tulio John Paul M., son of Mr. and Mrs. John A. Tulio. Bautista May Janine O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel O. Bautista. Bulatao Annie D., daughter of Mrs. Mary Jane I. Lopez. Castañeda Kyla M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Norberto P. Castañeda. Katunggal Shan Kai C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. McCoy C. Katunggal. De Guzman Jamaica S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo B. De Guzman. De Guzman Maricar A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo B. De Guzman. De la Cruz Giselle Ann D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto A. De la Cruz. De los Santos Joanna M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose M. De los Santos. Ferrer Carla M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel C. Ferrer. Muerong Mary Ann C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Armando D. Muerong. Parangat Angeline S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo F. Parangat. Parayawan Cristel R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eusebio C. Parayawan. Peralta Glyza May T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dindo M. Peralta. Peralta Princess Diane Q., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo A. Peralta. Reyes Andrina C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador P. Reyes. Rosario Vina D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Willie R. Rosario. Vega Rudilin S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dante O. Vega. Ventura Princess B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo F. Ventura. Ilarde Marinel Kia F., with honors, Outstanding Cadet of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edgar R. Ilarde.
Grade 10 Garnet Computers. Advisor Dr. Gina M. Lacunsay. Antonio Eduardo C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Antonio. Aquino R.J.C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Aquino. Arcangel Jerome J., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nicasio Arcangel. Bataan Melvin S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Bataan. Breva Darrell D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Breva. Bulataw Ronnie F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Modesto Bulataw. Kaidik John Ray A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ray Kaidik. Dayondon Cesar Jr. F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Cesar Dayondon Sr. Guzman Jerwin A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Luis Guzman. Guzman Romuel T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo de Guzman. Elegino John Carl D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Carlito Elegino. Espinosa Mark Lester R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Espinosa. Garcia John Lester S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joel Garcia. Macam Rene R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Macam. Meneses John Michael Q., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lazaro Meneses. Peralta John Christian D., Sports Awardee, Pencac Sila, son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Peralta. Rafael Kevin D., son of Mr. and Mrs. John Rafael. Resuelio Kurt Rachel B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Resuelio. Rosario Braille D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Rosario. Rosario Clinstein B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Rosario. Rosario Ryan P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlito Rosario. Sanchez Kian John Paulo, son of Miss Ginaline Sanchez. Austria Jennifer F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jordan Austria. Cancino Alia M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Luis Cancino. Kayabyab May Ann G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Kayabyab. Shata Divina A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Vicente Shata Jr. Dula Jenny Rose D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rosario Dula. Esteban Risa May D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Impidio Esteban Jr. Martin Jenny May M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Generoso Martin. Palaganas Rose Ann A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Palaganas. Rosario Mary Ann P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Josefino Rosario. Rosario Ronalen F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Rosario. Salvador Ronalyn R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Salvador. Sanchez Hazel May L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Sanchez. Soriano Angeline May M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Soriano. Grade 10 Fair Completers. Advisor, Ma'am Arlene T. Abellera. Absolute, John Michael E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mariano M. Absolute Jr. Aquino Adrian D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Monroe A. Aquino. Arabiana Kevin Carl F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benedicto F. Arabiano. Austria John Paulo A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio B. Austria. Cabansag Robert A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo Cabansag. Custodio Arman C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Armando B. Custodio. De Guzman Rolly Jr. B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rolly R. De Guzman Sr. De la Cruz Alan Paul C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Angel P. De la Cruz. Ebro James A., son of Mrs. Mirna A. Ebro. Manson Jason S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Junjun Manson. Quinto Leandro Jr. P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Leandro Quinto Sr. Rubilius Ginro T., son of Mr. Jesus B. Rubilius. Uson Wilkinson D., son of Mrs. Rachel D. Uson. Albanyo Leia M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leopoldo C. Albanyo. Aquino Micaela Joy D., daughter of Mrs. Julie D. Aquino. Aquino Rica D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Aquino. Arayata Jasmine D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Arayata. Asuncion Nicole A., daughter of Mr. Bonifacio S. Asuncion. Barlaan Noreen A., daughter of Mrs. Nelfa A. Barlaan. Batislaong Archel D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michelle D. Batislaong. Bautista Angeline May D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo S. Bautista. Castro Jovelyn M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo Castro. Castro Maritone G., Girl Scout of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio A. Castro. De la Cruz Kate Darrell R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolly M. De la Cruz. Dumalanta Iran Gaines R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John F. Dumalanta. Dumantay Acelea P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Saldi Dumantay. Espinosa Roslyn May Yu, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Espinosa. Esteva Cassandra Joy S., daughter of Mrs. Lori Manleo. Galyasa Disneyland D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Adi D. Galyasa. Gonzales Jamel T., daughter of Mrs. Marites T. Gonzales. Gutierrez Jean Hart C., daughter of Mrs. Judith C. Gutierrez. Juan Yancy Ann C., daughter of Mrs. Mary Ann C. Juan. Martinez Pauline Andrea B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joven F. Martinez. Modomo Maricar M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Saldi Modomo. Peralta Jackie B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel B. Peralta. Peralta Shikina Yang G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Oscar R. Peralta. Resuello Arabella Grace A., daughter of Mrs. Virginia Resuello. Rosario April Joy M., with honors. Homemaker of the Year, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Miguel C. Rosario. Serrano Kimberly I., daughter of Mrs. Annabel De Jesus. Velasco Geraldine B., daughter of Mrs. Helen Barrios.
Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance. chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. Gratitude makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow. That is according to Melody Diate. Let us find time to stop and thank the people who make a difference in our lives. This time, let us listen to Glycel F. de Guzman, the completer with the highest general average, as she renders her words of thanks.
Despite all the rough patches I've encountered, I've managed to survive 4 long years. It seems it was only yesterday when I first entered high school, unknowing what awaits me beyond. But one thing I know and believe is that being in high school also means growing up. It's been a journey filled with twists and turns, ebbs and flow. And now, I'm here together with all the completers of Batch 2020, closing a chapter and about to begin a new milestone in our lives. During my stay in the institution, I always aim to give my best in everything I do and hitch the wagon to a star. However, there are times that I fell short on these words. On my first year high school, I was really devastated when I found out that I was in the last section. I keep on questioning myself why. My parents share the same sentiments with me. Frustration and dismay. Fortunately, I was able to stand back up because of the people I love the most. I realized that being in the last section wasn't bad at all. Remember that in life, we always start at the bottom, and it's up to us on how we will work on our way to the top. So, to my parents and titas, thank you for always being there for me. Thank you for believing that whatever my dreams are, I can make them into reality. And for reminding me that it is okay to fail sometimes, for failures will make you a better person. To our teachers, thank you for the never-ending patience in teaching us not only academic lessons, but also lessons that will forever remain in depth in our hearts. More importantly, we will never forget you. Thank you for all the memories we've shared in junior high, whether good or bad, because through those, we've discovered more of ourselves and learned from those discouraging experiences and our past mistakes. To my friends who were there throughout the journey, thank you for never doubting me. You made my high school life so much more colorful. Let us continue lifting each other's spirit. To all the people who helped me reach this point in my life, I am grateful to have you. And to the Batch 2020, as we embark on a new chapter of our life, always remember that learning doesn't stop inside the classroom. Learning continues wherever we are. Congratulations and mabuhay po tayong lahat. And of course, to the giver of life, you are truly the light that guides me home.
Thank you, Glycel, for your heartwarming and touching words of thanks. This time, let us listen to John Irvin D. Gonzalez, the completer with the second highest general average, as he leads the Pledge of Loyalty.
May I invite my fellow completers to join me in reciting the Pledge of Loyalty with pride and commitment. Pledge of Loyalty to Alma Mater. We, the completers of 2020, believing in the noble ideals of Speaker Eugenio Perez, National Agricultural School, realizing that her honor and prestige rest on her completers, do hereby pledge to demonstrate in our lives high standard of discipline, loyalty, and service, to commit to ourselves that we will bring honor and glory to our parents, to Alma Mater, to God, and to our country, and to uphold faithfully the noble ideals for which the Speaker Eugenio Perez National Agricultural School stands for. So help us God.
Thank you, John Arvid. Your family in Sepnas look forward to your commitment in bringing glory to our alma mater. Heads up, completers! Stop, look, and listen as the Moving Up song be played with audio-visual presentation.
That was awesome and wonderful. Indeed, those memories will remain to be cherished in every completer's heart. This event has truly been noteworthy. Remember that your future is bright for all the times of late burning midnight candles, lack of sleep, projects, researches, performance tasks, exams, and all your sacrifices of enjoyment. Your reward is here. Moving up is truly another cornerstone of life that we must all celebrate. Indeed, do not forget that it is also a time of gratitude for all these achievements and a time to build a stronger faith as you're all about to face a new beginning in life. It must be a very proud moment for you, and for all of the hard work you have put in has totally paid off.
Indeed, it is something to be celebrated. So, that concludes our 2020 virtual Moving Up ceremony. Thank you with all our hearts, our dear completers, for making our school year remarkable, worth remembering and far-reaching. In behalf of the school's administrative and facilitative staff, we joyfully congratulate our completers for a job well done. Congratulations to all the parents and advisors. Likewise, we sincerely thank all the donors of the medals and awards, those who helped and supported us, and all our guests who willingly extended their time and effort during these most trying times.
Again, along with
Gina M. Lacunsay,
I am your MC, Caroline A. Kayabyab, saying, you can achieve whatever you want in life.
but all you have to do is to believe that you can.
All of us here believe in you. So, spread out your wings. Make the most of it, our dear completers. Mabuhay! Thank you very much. And stay safe, everyone.